Welcome to Crucial Conversations, a series of conversations with various guests to engage in difficult subjects. This series is coming to you from Central Christian Church in downtown Indianapolis. This month's series is on anti-racism. Our focus is not on interpersonal violence of racism, but systemic racism that is rooted in our institutions, including the church. Please join us each week on Thursdays when we release new episodes. Welcome back to Crucial Conversation. I am Pastor Louise. Today, as we continue our conversation about anti-racism, we have Pastor Grace and Pastor Linda here with us. The last couple of conversations we've had were with Reverend Terri Hord Owens and Jessica Louise. Today, our conversation is going to go back and talk a little bit about what are the things that we heard during those conversations. Each of you had the opportunity to listen to those conversations. It was a great opportunity for myself to be able to speak with each of them. So what were some highs in those conversations that stood out to you?
I can start. I think one of the helpful questions that I heard in Reverend Terri Hord Owens' interview was kind of that question that she says they're wrestling with within Reconciliation Ministry and the general ministries of our denomination, and that is, what is actually the vision of an anti-racist church? When we say that vision is 20 years old, right, for our denomination. But what do we mean by that? And I think some of the things that stood out to me were the fact that it's not enough to have the right words and the right statements. Those are important at different moments, but that it needs to go beyond that to action, and not just action within the church, but action within society. And I think that's something that we're thinking a lot about in our own congregation's anti-racism transformation team, and what how we both work internally on our own organization and its own practices and structures, and how we look at those through an anti-racist lens, but then also how we carry that into the world. So I think the things that we often think about are like training, but training is not an end in itself. The goal is not for everybody to be trained. Yeah. The goal is to have an impact on the world around us, and training is a way to get there. So I just thought that was a helpful question and reflection.
And I think that one thing that Jessica Louise sort of brought to that idea of vision was she talked a lot about radical imagination. And I think that so often, especially in the church, our imaginations are somewhat stifled by tradition, by like, this is how we do things here, this is how things work. And so the idea of being able to listen to people who are outside of our structures, who can tell us, when we're getting things wrong, or are able to sort of set the standard of even what kind of things we need to be talking about. And so I think that gift of radical imagination is one that the church, I hope, can continue to cultivate, and to be thinking with an eye toward an anti-racist future, and how that may not look like what we're doing right now.
Mm-hmm. Were there any other things that stood out to you in those conversations?
Well, one interesting thing that stood out was that both of our guests talked about the disciples' open table from two sort of different angles. And so there's this idea of we welcome all to the table, God welcomes all. But one thing that I have wrestled with in my seminary classes was this idea that Jessica Louise brought up of what does it mean when radical welcome actually makes people feel unsafe. When we say, well, you can come Like, is there a line to our welcome that may keep out someone who has explicit white supremacist views? So like we let them in, but we don't, and by letting them in, it is saying something about other people who are welcome as well, and whether they may feel comfortable coming into our space, and not just comfortable, but safe. So I think that is just something I'm thinking through from both of their conversations about how do we, on the one hand, exercise this radical welcome of all sexual orientations, gender identities, cultural expression, racial identity, all these different things. And when can inclusivity, I guess, start to feel dangerous?
Yeah, that is a challenging push, right? Because as we try to help people understand, the conversation about being an anti-racist institution isn't just the interpersonal things. It's about what systems we've had in place that have pushed others away in that. And so in having that radical welcome, what does that mean? What does that look like? And does that change, right? Does that reset the norm? And then what becomes normative? And so in 10 years from now, does that radical welcome still look the same, right? So I think that's what I hear in their comments and the pushing forward as well.
You know, here at Central, we have wrestled with that question in other ways. You know, you mentioned sexual orientation, gender identity. So Central is an open and affirming congregation, which is not just about that, but that's kind of often the focus of it. And so we have, we've had people say, most churches are not welcoming of me as a gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender person. And so I need that kind of safe place. But if people come in who really are hostile to me, then it doesn't feel open. It doesn't certainly feel affirming. So, we never really, I don't think there's a solution to that, or at least I haven't, really seen one, but it is, I think in a lot of different ways, that question hits the church.
Were there anything in the conversations that you heard that were challenging, that pushed you out of a particular space, that made you think a little differently?
I would bring up the question of defunding the police. I think that's a very challenging issue for, that we're all dealing with right now. And it was a short conversation, and that wasn't the whole topic. So there wasn't really time, I feel like, in your conversation with Jessica Louise, to go too deeply into it. But I think that is worthy of a lot of conversation. I feel like there are parts of it that are more straightforward. I think mental health is often mentioned. Like, we need to fund people and organizations that are skilled in dealing with mental health situations. We just, right now, the case from Rochester, is Daniel Prude is a prime example of how we need to get specialists in mental health dealing with that kind of crisis. But I think there are lots of other, kinds of functions that the police have that we would also need to think through. There's certainly theological questions related to human nature. That how do we as a society limit the impact of sin and violence on the rest of society? And we have to have some way to do that. And I think the police have been a primary way we do that. Now we are clear that it is a structure, it is an institution like all of our institutions that perpetuate racist behavior. And so I hope at some point we have an opportunity to really dig on that.
So when I hear the conversation about defund the police, I also hear about how we as a community have kind of abdicated our responsibilities. Somewhere along the line, we decided that we were no longer going to be responsible for the community in certain aspects, and we threw that responsibility onto the police. And in doing so, that meant more police officers, more funding to deal with those particular issues. And I think a lot of that becomes, we trust this system to deal with those issues. And talking about being anti-racist institutions, it is the behavior of, instead of dealing with the issues, we just say we support them and that's it. And so I think a portion of this is, how do we challenge, how do we push back, how do we say to communities, you do have the responsibility to care for individuals in your community. And I think that's sometimes not talked about, because when we use the word defund the police, it alienates people out of the conversation, unfortunately. And it goes back to what you were saying about that radical welcome, that when you have people in this space, who do you push out? But at the same time, I also think, if the person I'm pushing out is the person who supports that system that does harm, then it's okay at that moment, because we all need a safe space to talk about that. It's almost as if when you have a group of different friends and then you get them all together for the first time and they're getting to meet each other, and you realize, I don't think this friend is going to get along with this friend, so we may not have them all together, and you pick and choose how you have those kind of conversations with them. So I was really, I agree. I wish we had more time to kind of talk about that topic of defund the police.
And I do think one place that the church can sort of lend itself in these conversations about defunding is to really be thinking through theologically about punishment, because I think, in a lot of ways, we have to look at these systems as set up to punish certain people. So for instance, when Amber Geyer killed Botham Jean, there was in Dallas, there was this sense of like, oh, well, at least she got sent to prison. She was convicted of, I think it was murder, and sent to prison for 10 years. And so the system in that instance somewhat worked out the way that people wanted it to. But that didn't stop. I mean, how many people have been killed by the police since then? So like, there's this idea of like, well, we can just punish the bad apples. We can reform these things, but I think it's also important to bring into the conversation, the first time any comprehensive study of police brutality has been done in the United States was in the late 1800s for like billy club beatings. We've tried to reform this stuff for a really long time, and ultimately one thing that I really appreciate about prison abolitionists, criminal punishment abolitionists, is they're saying, it can feel comforting to want to reform some of these systems. It feels like we want to believe that, especially for white people who have never had interaction with police that feels threatening, that we can believe that that kind of behavior can happen everywhere. But if a society is set up to punish certain people, there's policing is going to punish those people. And so I think it's really important to take a look at that honestly and say, looking at cycles of like, oh, we're going to reform the police, we're going to fund them even more so they can implement these reforms. We're going to give them more resources. That was one of the campaign promises of Joe Biden, like $300 million more for the police. Well, you can give them more money and say they're going to do something good with it, but when has that ever been the case? So I think we need to really look at that and be honest about like what, and and listen to people when they say, you know, I have many, many more encounters with the police than you do, and they're extremely negative and harmful. And so, yeah, just really listening to that and trying to understand, like, how can we reduce this harmful institution's contact with really vulnerable people?
The challenge is, how do we help people understand that when a group like Black Lives Matter says defund the police, it isn't trying to only address the issues that affect the Black community. You know, this goes back, you know, towards the civil rights movement, right? When we heard Black leaders throughout that movement says, in doing this for the Black community, it is best for all communities, right? Helping this community out helps you out as well. And sometimes I think the issue that people have is it says, well, that doesn't seem fair. Why are you only focusing on that particular group? And so in addressing the issues that happen in the Black community when it comes to the interaction with the police, you're also helping out other communities as well, right? You have plenty of people say, oh, well, there's more white people shot by police than Black people. Well, I said, well, technically, yeah, you're correct. You're also a larger part of the population, right? And when you see a smaller population have just as many as a larger population, you start to ask, okay, it isn't just an issue of numbers, there's something there. And so too often the Black community becomes the lead and the push for reform, and people attack them and who they are, not necessarily listening to the reform that needs to be done all over.
Yeah.
And so I think it's, you know, when we push, when we say things, I think that's where we need to help people understand that this is a benefit for all of us in addressing these needs. One of the things that challenged me in the conversation, and was particularly with Jessica. I've known Jessica for a long time, and you know, I've seen her growth, and she kind of talked about it in different ways. But she made a comment that really challenged me that I've been thinking about in many different ways. And it's the conversation where she said, I can either spend my energy on helping a community become woke, or help a community, or being allies with the community, or I can spend my energy on lifting up my people, right? And she says, at this time, I would rather spend my energy in lifting up my people. And that becomes an interesting conversation, right? You know, for me, as a person of color on staff here, I enjoy working as an ally with the church and trying to address systematic racism and to help those within the community kind of understand what we're trying to do, as well as learn. I want to be partners in that particular process. But then I also say, outside of this particular space, I don't have the energy to do it in other spaces. And so the question for me, you know, that challenged me is, where do I want my energy to go? Do I really want to spend my time explaining myself over and over to people? Do I want to help, you know, remind people of the facts? Or do I want to spend time lifting up, you know, my community and sharing with my community and supporting my community? Some people say, well, that seems kind of selfish. I said, well, again, in supporting, you know, the Hispanic community here in Indianapolis, in itself, I will also be supporting other communities, right? Which will lift all of us up in that particular time. So that was, for me, that's something that I've been thinking about, as in the sense of, where do we spend our time and our energy? Mm-hmm. Which kind of leads me to think about, we're having this conversation not just as individuals in this particular space, but we're also having these conversations as leaders within Central Christian Church about, what is it that we do? What can we do? What are the next steps for us? Where do we take our energy next in this conversation of being an anti-racist institution? Any thoughts on where do we go from here?
Sure. Thoughts, plenty of thoughts. So I think that is a great question and a great challenge, and I think everybody needs to think about that, because part of what she was saying was it's okay. It's important. It's more than okay. It's really important that people do work in different ways and work in the way that is for them the best use of their energy, right? I'm going to misquote Howard Thurman, but the idea that you have to find what makes you alive and then give that to the world. Not start with what the world needs from me, what makes you alive, and go give that to the world. So, and she talked a lot about sort of the coexisting and the overlapping of different organizations and different people's approaches. So I think that's really important. Here at Central, I think we're a diverse group of people in many ways, and so we're all going to have different kinds of energy to do things. I think what we are trying and hoping to do is to help people at least get a framework for understanding and acting on whatever changes we feel are important to make, both internally and then changes to work on externally. One of the things that has just happened recently, I think also ties into the conversations that you had, both of these conversations, and that is around minority-owned or Black-owned businesses. Our congregation this year has a budget surplus, because our giving has remained constant while our expenses are under budget because of a lot of things that are not happening due to the pandemic. So our leaders, and most recently our board, wrestled with, well, what do we do with that? What we usually do is we sock it in the bank, right, for some other time. And but in this environment, where we have learned that, I think the figure is that 41% of Black-owned businesses have had to close due to the pandemic, while 17% of white-owned businesses have. In this kind of environment, can we use that money in a better way? And so just this week, our board made the decision to make a significant donation to the Urban League here in Indianapolis and their program to provide training and support for minority-owned businesses. And I think that's a pretty significant step for a congregation to take, and just the conversation that led to it, I think was really, really helpful for us. So that's just one example of an action, kind of beyond our own walls or community that can have a significant impact on, not millions, but on dozens of people and on the city.
Yeah, and it makes me, as I listen to you speak about that, it makes me think when we make the statement, hey, we have a surplus, right? Meaning giving was still the same, but we didn't have to spend money on these ministries, other things that we were doing, right? And so because of the year we had, and so the question goes, what do we do with it? So it makes us think for the future. What were we doing with that money before, and were those things necessary for the life of the church? And is supporting something like this something that we can do ongoingly? So those are things that pop up in my mind as I listen to you talk about it. And I'm really excited to hear that we have made that decision in that process. So, yeah. What do you think, Grace?
Yeah, I think it's always just important to keep being self-reflective, kind of like you said. Is this something we can do in the future? And really, I think the pandemic gives us an opportunity to take a look at our ministries. Are the things that we're doing things that are crucial to the life of the church? What really is crucial, I think, in the life of the church is something a lot of churches are wrestling with right now. Like, if it's not, always being in the building, or, just lots of questions around that. And then I think making this contribution to the Urban League can open up other possibilities too. I think that's one of the things about doing any kind of work for change is once you get started, like more avenues begin to open up to you. And sometimes people have a hard time taking that first step because they're like, is this the right thing to do? Well, it may not be the perfect thing to do, but sometimes, searching for this perfect anti-racist program to start with is truly the enemy of the good. So I think taking some things, trying, getting feedback, if it totally bombed, like we can reevaluate and move forward. But so many more possibilities can open up once we start. And it sort of reminds me of the book group that recently concluded on Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. The protagonist of that book, God gives her a religion called Earthseed. And she talks a lot about shaping God and how God is change. And I think one of the things that we saw happen in the book was that the more they were able to sort of move forward, make new choices, and be prepared for the future, and to try new things, the more their world opened up. And I think that is just keep following those opportunities as they emerge.
Yeah. That's I think I want to read that book now that you guys have gone through this.
I hope everyone reads that book.
Yeah.
Now that I've read it with the group, you can, I'll lend you my copy.
I think one of the things that I hear from you is it's okay to take a chance and fail.
Yeah.
Right? Because in the process of trying to work towards a good, you're going to make mistakes, and everything isn't a perfect ABC and then we're done. There's a lot of things that can happen in the process, and so it kind of I know you like to use the metaphor of jazz, many different things playing at the same time, and it doesn't necessarily need to be perfect, sometimes the beauty of jazz that it's not, it's on time, but it may not sound like it. And when people come in and jump in on it, it's exactly what the music needs at that particular moment. And so I think, the best part of the conversations we have with among ourselves and with those individuals who have been a part of this series on anti-racism is the fact that, overall I keep hearing that it doesn't need to be and or. Is that the right terminology?
Either or.
Either or, sorry. It doesn't need to be either or. That our process of working towards that, it doesn't have to be this and that. It can be both and. And that is the most encouraging part of this, that there can be learning as we move forward. And I think that is probably the most helpful thing. That if we're unwilling to make this step right away, there's still this possibility to get involved. And when you've gotten involved here and you realize, okay, maybe I can do more, then another opportunity comes up, which is what you mentioned, right? So I guess the perfect ending and culmination of this conversation is for us to be flexible to the possibilities of where we're moving next when it comes to that. So it may start off, Central Christian Church is working at how do we stop being an anti-racist institution, but then it ends up being something else along in that particular process as we are dealing with this. And who knows what that looks like, right? I think that's the beauty in there. That's the creativity in the conversation. So I want to thank you again, for your time and for your patience in doing all this. And I look forward to being able to come back and see, months from now where we've taken these conversations and what we've done with them. So thanks again for being with us today.